நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலத்தாள் வாழ்க.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலத்தாள் வாழ்க.
I'm sitting in the old hall in Ramanasramam. This, for a period of well over 20 years, was the beating heart of Ramanasramam. This is where Bhagavan lived, this is where he taught, this is where he held court, and this is where he met with all the thousands of people who came to see him between about 1928 and the mid-1940s, when this particular building was too small for the vast crowds which were by then coming to see him. When Bhagavan first came down the hill from Skandashram, the only building was a thatched shed over the mother's samadhi. The shed was divided into a small temple area where pujas went on to the mother, and there was a small private area where Bhagavan himself lived and slept. Devotees who came to Ramanasram at that time, such as Maragana, Krishnamurti Iyer, report having to go into this very small, tiny, poky little coconut leaf hut and to meet and interact with Bhagavan in a very small space in what was little more than a temporary shed. As the ashram started to develop in the 1920s and more people began to come, it was realized that a bigger space was needed for Bhagavan to live in and receive the increasing number of visitors who were starting to come. Now, Chinnaswami, Bhagavan's brother, was very much attached to the building over the mother's samadhi, and he wasn't comfortable with the idea of a second building in the ashram where Bhagavan would teach. He wanted the ashram always to be centered around the mother's samadhi. So the other devotees played a little trick on him. They said they were going to build a new kitchen and dining room, and Chinnaswami said, great, we need a new kitchen and dining room. So this particular building we're in now was constructed, and for the entire duration of the construction, Chinnaswami was under the mistaken idea that this was going to be the new dining room. They even managed to put in a fireplace and have a chimney on the roof just to make it look more realistic. And then on the day it was finally completed, I think Chinnaswami was the only one who wasn't aware of this. They just simply moved Bhagavan in, and Chinnaswami had to accept it as a fait accompli. So if you look at the old photos of this hall in the 1930s, on the apex of the roof you can still see the old chimney there. That chimney wasn't demolished for at least 10 years after Bhagavan moved in here. Bhagavan originally sat on a very low bench in a corner over here, slightly elevated above everybody else, and there's a story of how a devotee called Gaunda is one of the caste names of South India, brought a new sofa which he'd paid for himself and persuaded Bhagavan, or attempted to persuade Bhagavan to sit on it. Bhagavan didn't like special treatment for himself, and he don't think he liked the idea of being elevated so far above everybody else, and he didn't like the idea of a comfortable existence that involved mattresses and cushions while everybody else sat on the floor. After lots of toing and froing, when Bhagavan at one point was so against being above everybody else that he got off his little bench and sat down on the floor again, level with everybody else, Mr. Gaunda started crying and wailing and successfully managed to create such a disturbance in front of Bhagavan for 3 days that finally Bhagavan gave up, and just for the sake of quietness in the hall, I think he agreed to sit on the sofa and make that his home. So this was considered a great feat by Mr. Gaunda, so all the devotees forever after nicknamed him Sofa Gaunda for his feat of persuading Bhagavan to get off the floor and live and sleep on this particular bed. This is the original sofa which Sofa Gaunda donated. The cloths, some of the cloths are original, the cushions are original. What is not? Well, this is the original railing. This came along a little bit later. The people who were looking after Bhagavan, one of their principal jobs was to try and prevent people from physically touching Bhagavan's body. He had a very sensitive body, and it was noticed that he would get physically ill if certain types of people would touch his feet, And there's one instance when someone managed to hug him, managed to evade the attention of the attendants, and Bhagavan's body actually broke out in welts across his chest when this misguided devotee hugged him. So it was agreed that to protect Bhagavan's health and to give him a little distance, a railing would be put up around the sofa, and this was the limit that devotees could approach, and that would stop people coming right up to the sofa trying to touch his feet and so on. Bhagavan was somewhat amused by this railing when it appeared. He just called it his jail, because from his vantage point all he could see was a row of vertical bars keeping people out, away from him. And when he wasn't here, which he wasn't in the early days for much of the day, and somebody would come to the ashram to meet him, somebody would be dispatched from the hall to find him. He might be in the cowshed, he might be in the kitchen, and Bhagavan would sigh and shrug his shoulders and say, "I've got to go back to jail." So in a sense, this sofa was his confinement area. This is the place where he had to be on duty. This is the place where he had to sit, answer questions, be stared at all day. And it wasn't really what he wanted to do a lot of the time. I think he was very comfortable with being out and about in the ashram. He liked to be involved in all the chores which the other devotees had to do, the washing, the cleaning, the cooking, the cowshed. But they felt it was disrespectful to have Bhagavan do most of the more menial activities. He insisted on being in charge of the kitchen. He insisted on going there at 2, 3 a.m. every morning and starting the cutting of the vegetables. But I think bit by bit he was sidelined from other activities such as carrying water, washing clothes. They were considered very low class, very demeaning activities, and one shouldn't allow one's gurus to do these things. So bit by bit, Bhagavan was more and more confined to his little jail inside these railings. Crowds would come. He would spend most of his day here, except for periodic trips to the ashram kitchen to check up on the food, trips to the cowshed to see what was going on, to see Lakshmi, trips to the dining room to eat, and walks on the hill. For the rest of the time he was based in here, and people would sit filling the whole hall. There was a sexual segregation. The women would be on one side and the men on the other. Now there's a very short, narrow section in front of me, and this is obviously the best seat in the house, so it wasn't always women here or men here. There was a kind of rota system that sometimes the women got these seats and sometimes the men. And once in a while, as the earth changes its polarity and everything moves backwards and forwards, the male-female portions of the hall would also move, and the men would get front row seats for a while and the women would get front row seats. What's also interesting is that originally the main door for this new hall was over there. Over there is where Bhagavan's Samadhi Hall is currently located. There was a door in the center of that wall and 2 or 3 steps down into an open courtyard. That's the access through which most of the people who came to Bhagavan in the 30s used. As Bhagavan became feeble later in life, it was noticed that he was struggling to climb the stairs to come in. One interesting thing about Bhagavan is that irrespective of how weak and incapacitated he was, he never let anyone help him to climb stairs or negotiate obstacles. He had to be able to do it himself, or he couldn't do it at all. No one was allowed to put a hand under his arm or help him upstairs. So when it was realized that the stairs were proving an inconvenience for him, these particular doors were closed. They're still there. And another doorway was opened on the side facing Arunachala. That meant that Bhagavan could walk in at ground level and have easy access to come in and go out to the dining room. Now originally, in Bhagavan's day, the ashram was a lot more compact than it is now. So as he would get up off his sofa and walk to the old doorway, he would enter an alleyway, a passageway which is covered to protect him when it rained, and that was the old dining room. So the place where Bhagavan's Samadhi is currently located was, until the late 1930s, the main ashram kitchen and dining area. So he would go in there, cut vegetables, eat his food, and then through the ashram dining room a little bit further, where the mother's temple is now, is the original, or one of the original structures over the mother's temple. So the old ashram was very much a compact single building. There was the old hall situated here. Next, away from the hill, was the kitchen dining room, and beyond that was the mud and thatch building which constituted the Mother's Temple until the new building was begun in 1939. Now, somewhere about where I'm sitting right now was a stool. This was the stool where devotees would bring offerings. They'd bring their bananas, they'd bring their fruits. They would be put on the stool here. When not many people were coming, they would be distributed as prasad amongst everybody in the hall. But when the flow of visitors and the flow of offerings increased, then it wasn't considered healthy for Bhagavan to have to taste and nibble every 5 minutes all day. So a lot of the offerings went straight to the kitchen. They were amalgamated and distributed at the next mealtime. In winter, there was a stool here also, which had a small charcoal brazier on it. You can see this on some of the old photos, a narrow base coming out like this, and inside there would be burning charcoal, and that was the only heat that Bhagavan ever allowed himself to have. It got quite cold in here in winter, but he refused to have anything that would keep him warm. He never wore anything except a loincloth. Sometimes you see him with a dhoti under his armpits, but so far as I'm aware, he never had blankets at night. He never had anything to keep himself warm at night, and if it was a little bit cold, he simply had this charcoal brazier on during the winter months. For a long time there was a resistance to having electricity also. I think Bhagavan was a bit of a, I wouldn't call him a miser, but he didn't like wasting money or resources. And so there was a gigantic hand-propelled fan. And in olden times these were called punkas. They were huge, great coconut leaf constructions. And so, imagine a hand fan about 100 times bigger that's pulled by people on ropes, and the rope pullers were called punkawallahs. So there was a gigantic punka which kept Bhagavan cool, but he insisted it be big enough that everybody in the hall benefited from the wind. He wouldn't let anyone fan him if everybody else in the hall wasn't getting fanned as well. This proved to be somewhat inconvenient for all the devotees. Bhagavan was tough. Bhagavan could stand any amount of heat or cold, and he didn't like any arrangement which warmed him up or cooled him down, which didn't provide equal opportunities for heating and cooling to everybody else. So there are reports of everybody in the hall sweating madly in summer, and Bhagavan not permitting the ashram fan to be put on, saying, sweating is healthy, we should all sweat, it's good for the body.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravazhga Vimochanameyyan Virai.
The stool, which is more or less where I'm sitting now, there's a lovely story that Katia Osborne, who was Arthur Osborne's daughter, told me many years ago. On her first visit with her mother, Arthur was interned in a prisoner of war camp in what is now Thailand, and he didn't join the family till 1945. When Lucy Osborne and her children came on their first visit, they didn't really know what the protocol was, especially Katya, who was quite young at the time. And she walked in, looked around, and she was a Westerner who was used to looking for a chair and sitting on a chair, and the only object that she could see that looked like a chair was the offering stool in front of Bhagavan. So she came in, she looked around, she marched up and sat on top of the offering stool. And of course everybody laughed, and then somebody said, oh, she's offered herself to Bhagavan. So I think that's a very auspicious start to a child's career at Ramanasramam, to come and put yourself on the offering stool in front of Bhagavan. Now off to my left over here was the original ashram library. There were several cupboards here. Bhagavan had his own private, well, when I say private, the books that he consulted a lot, that he used a lot, were on a revolving bookcase about here. And there was a noticeable tendency when people asked for references, Bhagavan would take a book off the shelf, and without having to search for it, the book would automatically fall open at the page that he was looking for. This happened so many times that devotees in the hall just accepted that Bhagavan had this peculiar knack, this peculiar power of just picking up a book and having it open at the right page without having to thumb through an index or look at the contents page. There was just something about him that facilitated these things to happen in a very natural way. When I arrived in the ashram in the mid-1970s, all of these old cupboards containing the ashram library books, they'd been moved from the hall at that point to make more space. They were in the new hall, which we will visit later. I was given the keys and I went through them. It was a real Aladdin's cave. There were manuscripts in Bhagavan's handwriting, all kinds of old ashram books. There was an in-house librarian in Bhagavan's day. Somebody in the hall would check books in and out, so people who didn't want to sit and meditate all day, they could read these books in Bhagavan's presence. There's one story about this hall that somehow it strikes me I like it. I mean, lots of amazing things happened here, superb experiences, everybody felt very quiet, very peaceful. But I remember reading a story about a French academic who came here in the 1940s. The hall was crowded, and he must have been doing some research on Indian philosophy, and he was very persistent. He kept asking Bhagavan what was Bhagavan's understanding of the word samsara. Now, samsara might mean the process of birth and rebirth, manifestation, just the endless round of births and deaths, and the consequent suffering that we're all embedded in as a result of our ignorance. Bhagavan didn't appear to notice him or look at him, and that's something else that's interesting, because people would come and some would sit, some would pester Bhagavan with questions, sometimes he'd answer them, sometimes he'd ignore you. But the general feeling was, if you sat there long enough, somehow the answer would come. It might come, as Paul Brunton noted, that you come with a head full of questions, you never get them answered, but sooner or later your questions drop off one by one because you realize they're not important, that something more important is going on in this hall. There's a radiating silence, a presence coming off Bhagavan into you that is making any academic questions that you might have completely irrelevant. You no longer need to know the answer. You no longer need to understand philosophy, because Bhagavan is giving you a taste, an experience of what all these various philosophies are pointing at. That was his role, was to sit here in silence and communicate, insofar as everyone was able to receive it, some measure of that silence that he himself enjoyed all the time. Now, this man, being a foreigner and an academic, was quite persistent. He kept saying, Bhagavan, Bhagavan, what is samsara? And Bhagavan just ignored him. And then, I think on his third day, a VIP came to the Ramanasramam gates. It was one of the leading Congress politicians of the era who had been campaigning for independence for India. He was well known to all the devotees here, so they went down to the gate to greet him. I suspect the French scholar had probably never heard of him, and even if he had, he wasn't that interested in going down to say hello to an Indian politician at the gate. So one by one, the whole hall emptied until Bhagavan and the French scholar and the attendant were sitting here by themselves. And then Bhagavan just turned to him and said, for 3 days you've been asking me, what's samsara? People come here to get enlightened, but soon after they get here, they forget about enlightenment and get excited by something else. That's samsara.
Namo Ramanaya nalam peravalga vimochanameyyan virai.
Now, Bhagavan slept on this sofa behind the railing, and he himself, speaking from the highest standpoint, would say that he never slept. He would say that the sleep state is a superimposition on the real state of the self. For him, the various states that we think we have, because we identify with our bodies, the waking, the dreaming, and the sleep, to him they were just things that came and went on the continuous substratum of his own self. So one peculiarity, one ramification of this, is that he always seemed to be aware of what was going on around him, even when to external eyes it might look like he was asleep. I mean, he closed his eyes at night, people heard him snore, but there didn't ever seem to be a total lack of awareness. Now, Major Chadwick questioned him about this once and said, "How can you say that you don't sleep? We hear you snoring." And Bhagavan said, "I like snoring. If I didn't like it, I'd stop." But there seemed to be a fundamental, continuous awareness of who he was, and if his body was snoring at night, then he'd be aware of it. Now, one consequence or one outgrowth of this was that you could come and see Bhagavan at any time of the day or night in the late 1920s or early 30s. This is the only teacher I know about who was so insistent that every one of his devotees could have access to him that he wasn't even inside a closed room in the middle of the night. The doors to this hall were open 24 hours a day for at least 10 years. If you had a problem at 3 o'clock in the morning in 1935, you could walk in, you could sit in front of Bhagavan, and you would find Bhagavan awake, alert, ready to receive you. You didn't have to wake him up, his attendant didn't have to wake him up. Somehow Bhagavan would know that you were in there, that you had a problem. He'd open his eyes, and whatever problem you had, whatever transaction was needed, you could conduct it at 3 o'clock in the morning. I think this is one of the most extraordinary aspects of Bhagavan's teaching life, that there wasn't a time for probably 20 years when he wasn't accessible to devotees, except for when he was walking on the hill and when he was inside the bathroom having his bath. In the 1940s, the ashram management began to recognize that Bhagavan's body wasn't as strong as it used to be, and that he would probably benefit from having a short rest every day between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They all knew from previous experience of trying to limit access to him that he wouldn't go along with this ban on people looking at him for 2 hours during the day. So they tried to get round this by telling all the devotees that no one is allowed to go in the hall between midday and 2 p.m. because Bhagavan needs a rest. So on the first day, Bhagavan sat there and noticed that no one was sitting there, and of course his curiosity was aroused. So he came outside to find out why nobody was sitting with him anymore. And then somebody said, "Oh, but Bhagavan, we've been told that no one should go in there between midday and 2 o'clock." At which point Bhagavan himself sat outside the hall and refused to go back in. And when Chinnaswami came along and said, "Why are you sitting out here? You're supposed to be inside resting," Bhagavan said, "There's a new rule. No one is allowed to go in the hall between 12 and 2 o'clock, so that must include me. I'm going to sit outside for those 2 hours as well." Finally, after much negotiation, it was agreed by Bhagavan that he could have 2 hours downtime in the middle of the day between 12 and 2. There was an attendant who was on duty to make sure that people didn't come in, but as part of these negotiations, the door was in fact open, so if people did have emergencies, they could come in. The attendant would make some attempt to dissuade them if they thought it was just casual business which could wait. But I know of a couple of instances when people who really did need to see Bhagavan urgently just walked in between 12 and 2, and although the attendant tried to shoo them out, Bhagavan would say, no, this is important, let them stay. Perhaps one I've mentioned before is when Papaji came here and really wanted to know whether Ramana was the person who'd knocked on his door in the Punjab. He didn't know about the resting rule, so he just walked in. Krishna Swami, the hall attendant at the time, tried to make him go away, and Bhagavan said, no, let him come in. So if Bhagavan could see that you were in an advanced state, that you had urgent business that couldn't wait, he would overrule his attendant and allow you to come in and discuss whatever business you had with him. So this insistence that people should have access to him went on. In the later years, towards the late 1940s, of course, his health deteriorated. Access became less and less possible simply because he caught cancer, he was dying, he was recovering from operations. But there wasn't a single day of his life when Bhagavan was persuaded by either his doctors or the ashram management that his doors should be closed and that no one should have access. Even on his final day, everybody who wanted to see him was allowed to have a walking darshan past him in the room on the day he finally passed away.
Namo Ramanaya nalam peravazha vimochanameyyan virai.
When I first came here in the middle of 1976, I had a passion for Bhagavan, his teachings, and in particular self-inquiry. And the place in Ramanasramam that drew me more than any other was this particular hall. I've talked to people and they say, I like this place or I like that place. For me, this was where I felt most at home, most at peace with myself. This for me was the place where Bhagavan had sat and taught, and this was the place where I wanted to sit and pursue my practice. In those days hardly anybody was here. I would sit in a corner over there, same place every day, opposite the door. In those days the trees weren't so big, there wasn't a wall opposite the doorway, so sometimes I just opened my eyes and you could see the silhouette of Arunachal in front. I'd just look at the silhouette. Sometimes I'd close them, sometimes I'd look at Bhagavan's photo, this one behind me sitting on the sofa. And then I'd go back to inquiry. I was absolutely determined to follow Bhagavan's practical teachings on inquiry to the best of my ability and to do it as intensively as I could. I think something drew me here, something kept me here. I used to come about 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd get up once in a while just to get the cramps out of my legs and maybe walk up and down a little bit outside, and then I'd come back and sit another hour or two, go home for lunch. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd be the first person in, and often at night I'd be the last person out. I don't know what compelled me to do this. I just felt a passion that I had to sit here, I had to be here. I had to immerse myself in Bhagavan's presence, in the place where he lived, and to the best of my ability do the practice that he recommended the most highly. After that particular period of my life, I started to get more involved with other things. I started running the Ashram library, I started editing their magazine, other things came up. But I think what I got from sitting here, apart from a lot of peace, a lot of quiet, was the cultivation of a presence inside me. You can call that presence Bhagavan, you can call it grace, you can call it whatever you like. It's like having a recognition of an old friend inside yourself. You know it's there all the time. For me, that was the concrete result of doing Bhagavan's practice in this hall, that there's a tangible knowledge, a tangible presence of something inside yourself, and after a certain point I didn't really feel a need to sit here all day and look at it.
Namo Ramanaya nalam peravazha vimochanameyyan virai malattal vazha.
Namo Ramanaya nalam peravazha vimochanameyyan virai malattal vazha. Namo Ramanaya nalam peravazha vimochanameyyan virai malattal vazha. அடிமுடிக்குண்டாய அநாதித் தொடர்பின் விடமுடியாமை